the Hong Kong prodigal son, the microwave, and the cold-blooded killer who turned on his own biological parents. These were the keywords that haunted Hong Kong in 2013. One of the cases that sent shivers down the spine whenever mentioned, and those who witnessed the scene were so traumatized that they couldn't eat meat for a long time. In the end, what is the limit for a cruel madman? Since the 1960s, Sai Jing Pun has been one of the most famous areas located in the western suburbs of Hong Kong, known for its poultry market, tea shops, and renowned cuisine, attracting tourists from all over the world. For anyone living here, owning a home in this area was like possessing a golden goose. Fortunately, Mr. Chau Wing Kai and his wife Siu Yueti were one of those families. Since 1980, the couple had saved up enough money to buy an apartment in the Shing Pun area. Then, 10 years later, they sold it for twice the price they originally paid. Over time, they continued buying and selling, making high profits, and the couple soon became financially successful without worrying about their daily needs. However, in life, nothing is ever perfect. While luck and astute financial decisions helped them accumulate wealth, they faced many difficulties in raising their children. The Chaus had 2 sons, the older one, Shao Hing, and the younger one, Henry Chau. The eldest son had no significant issues, as he was obedient and worked hard at school. However, the youngest son, Henry Chau, became a constant worry for the family as he repeatedly caused troublesome problems. From a young age, Henry Chau was socially withdrawn. He seemed to always be in his own world. Even though his mother enrolled him in piano lessons to develop his talents, his academic performance at school was shockingly poor. As a teenager, Henry failed the Hong Kong Certificate of Education examination, which is equivalent to a high school diploma. This was truly a shock to Mr. and Mrs. Chau. They had always provided every opportunity for their child to succeed, but the outcome was heartbreakingly disappointing. However, things eventually settled down. Not long after, Mr. and Mrs. Chau did not give up. They believed that with effort and a change of environment, Henry Chau would become a successful person. In 2000, when Henry Chau was 15, his parents decided to send him to the Australian National University to study statistics. This was not an easy course to get into, but after much struggle, Henry managed to pass. Extremely excited to send their son off to school, his parents hoped that Henry Chau would recognize his own potential and make the most of the opportunity to develop himself. However, studying abroad was not a solution either, as Henry was repeatedly bullied and beaten in Australia. This discouraged him, and by 2003 he decided to drop out and return to Hong Kong before completing his studies, despite Mr. and Mrs. Chau still proudly claiming that their son had graduated from an Australian university. Since returning from Australia, Henry became increasingly withdrawn, distancing himself from the few friends he once had, and spent his time at home playing video games or immersing himself in Nazi ideology. He even used an image of Adolf Hitler as his symbol on his MSN account. Saying that their son had no ambition, Mr. and Mrs. Chau advised him to find a job. Though he was reluctant to work, Henry obeyed his parents and applied for a job, which he got fairly easily. However, Henry kept changing jobs, never staying in one company for long enough to make any real effort. In 2007, still determined to help their son find a direction in life, Mr. and Mrs. Chau paid for Henry to enroll in university again, but this time in Hong Kong. They also encouraged him to work part-time to gain life experience and motivation for his studies. Surprisingly, Henry listened to his parents, seeing everything going smoothly. Mr. and Mrs. Chau thought that their efforts had helped their son find the motivation to strive forward. However, they didn't know that this was only the beginning. In 2011, after completing his university program, a friend invited Henry to work at his company. But things didn't improve. He was soon fired after a few weeks for poor performance. Then he applied to work as a real estate reporter for a newspaper, but due to mistakes in his work, his boss reprimanded him. Unable to tolerate his superior's attitude, Henry quit again. His career path was difficult, but his love life wasn't necessarily the same. Henry, though small in stature, was quite attractive to women. He had romantic relationships with several women from mainland China, but never stayed with anyone for long. One day, one of Henry's girlfriends called and told him she was pregnant with his child. Henry, without hesitation, told her to get rid of it because he couldn't take care of it. Heartbroken by his betrayal, his girlfriend decided to cut off all contact with him and kept the baby. Though Henry knew he had a daughter, he never saw her, as he didn't care much. The troubles didn't stop there. In 2012, Henry borrowed a large sum of money to invest in stocks, but due to his lack of experience, he suffered losses. Mr. and Mrs. Chau once again witnessed their son's helplessness and had to step in to help him pay off his debt. But Henry continued to repay their kindness with resentment. That same year, he suggested that his parents sell their house, because it was now highly valuable. After selling it, the money should be divided into 3 parts, one for his parents, one for his older brother, and one for Henry himself. Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Chau did not want to do this. The older they got, the more they wanted a stable place to live, enjoying their final years in peace. Mr. and Mrs. Chau were unaware that this situation greatly upset Henry. Despite all the years they had provided Henry with the best education, helping him time and again, even paying off his debts so he wouldn't be hunted down, it was never enough for Henry. As life became increasingly hopeless, he grew more and more resentful of his parents, eventually blaming them as the main cause of his failures in life. Henry didn't have many friends, but he had one close companion, Angus. They met in 2007 when Henry was working part-time, and Angus was a new sales employee. Henry often treated Angus to good meals and bought him expensive clothes. When it came to family, Angus came from a completely different background than Henry. Angus's father had left when he was only 3, and his mother had to work 2 jobs daily to support and raise him and his sister, Amy. Despite this, their small family was very close-knit, and they rarely had any arguments. Even in relationships, Angus was different from Henry. Although he had few relationships, ironically, when he married an Indonesian woman, he learned on their wedding night that his wife already had a husband and a lover back in her homeland. Later, he attempted suicide after a girlfriend left him after he had spent all his money. Although he was fortunate to be saved, that suicide attempt caused significant brain damage, leaving him mentally slow. Whenever he tried to speak clearly, he struggled greatly. Despite their different backgrounds, Angus shared something in common with Henry when it came to academics. Angus didn't do well in school and failed most subjects. Additionally, because of his gentle nature, he had been bullied since he was young, often punched and kicked. Even with more brutal acts of violence, Angus never fought back. He always accepted it, enduring it quietly. It was these painful experiences that made Henry and Angus bond deeply. They grew closer, like brothers. In September 2012, after a series of personal failures, and even being refused by his parents when asking them to sell their house and split the assets, Henry confided in Angus. He then spoke about his suicidal thoughts, determined to do something grand before turning 30. Of course, as a close friend, Angus could only try to convince Henry not to go through with it. But Henry, 28 years old, who was struggling with life and always blaming others, took this advice in a different direction. This led the conversation to soon take a dark turn, as Henry came up with a malicious plan. The crime was quietly prepared. After that conversation in September 2012, Henry and Angus began discussing the plan more frequently through text messages. By January 2013, while Mr. Chau, 65, and Mrs. EU, 63, decided to retire and live happily with their children, Henry started gathering the necessary tools for his scheme, including a pork slicer, a hammer, a lunchbox, bleach, a refrigerator, a microwave, and a rice cooker. Henry Chau planned to purchase these items from various stores across Hong Kong between January and February to avoid suspicion. Occasionally, to be safer, he sent Angus to buy the items on his behalf. However, to ensure everything went smoothly, Henry Chau would still linger nearby, keeping an eye on his slow-witted friend. Even more disturbing, as mentioned earlier, Henry Chau was an accomplished pianist, and the appreciation of music by a villain sometimes reveals their dark psychological tendencies, even though music itself is innocent. During this period, while planning every detail, Henry Chau continuously listened to the song Vers la Flamme. While Angus found the music normal and didn't understand its significance, Henry Chau was nurturing a malicious mindset stoking the flames of hatred in a vile way. On February 25, 2013, after careful preparation and psychological conditioning, Henry Chau began taking the most important steps in his plan. Specifically, he invited his parents to visit his new apartment in the Tsui area of Western Hong Kong, claiming that he had changed positively and saved enough money to buy a small apartment. Although it wasn't a grand achievement, he hoped his parents would come and share in his joy. While Mr. and Mrs. Chau were surprised and pleased to see their son had truly matured, thinking it was a hopeful opportunity for him, ironically, the apartment was actually rented by Angus and had nothing to do with Henry Chau. On March 1, 2013, according to footage from security cameras in the Tsui building, Mr. and Mrs. Chau, along with Henry Chau, entered and waited for the elevator. Everything seemed normal until 20 minutes later, when Henry Chau suddenly left the apartment alone. He went to the hospital to treat cuts on his 2 hands. Although this action seemed fairly ordinary, a closer look revealed an unusual anxiety. Mr. and Mrs. Chau, however, were no longer seen. After several days with no news of his parents, the eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Chau found it strange and called Henry Chau. Henry Chau calmly said that he had overheard a conversation about his parents planning a trip to mainland China for leisure. Although it seemed odd that his parents suddenly decided to go on a trip without informing him and without any luggage, he quickly became convinced by his younger brother, thinking Henry Chau would never deceive him, and continued waiting. Around March 5, 2013, after waiting for news of his parents for too long, the eldest son urged Henry Chau to go with him to the West Police Station and report that their parents had gone missing. At the police station, Henry stated that he had last seen his parents on March 1, 2013. With Mr. Chau at the Laham Place building in Mong Kok, Kowloon, Hong Kong, about 7 kilometers from their home. Since that meeting, he had not seen or heard any news about his parents. In reality, at this point, Henry knew exactly where his parents were. He also knew they would never come back. A week after the Chau brothers filed the missing persons report on March 12, 2013, the police informed them that the immigration department had no record of Mr. and Mrs. Chau leaving Hong Kong. So, where had they gone? It was a mystery and a great concern for the Chau family and their friends. At this point, the Chau brothers did not hesitate any longer. They immediately launched a social media campaign to find their parents. Henry Chau created a Facebook post titled, "Parents Missing." He also contacted the online news platform Apple Daily to publish a story about his parents' disappearance. In a video clip addressing the viewers, Henry Chau explained that his parents enjoyed hiking in the mountains, and he feared they might have gotten lost or had an accident during their trip. On March 14, 2013, investigators called the Chau brothers in for questioning again. During the police interrogation, Henry Chau was able to use his mobile phone. Strangely, he secretly texted friends in a WhatsApp group called HK Taken and confessed that he had killed his parents. In the message, Henry Chau wrote, "I am a psychopath. I cannot empathize with the pain of an ordinary person because of the abuse I suffered as a child and teenager. My emotional development is different from others." On the morning of March 15, 2013, the police received a report from a member of the WhatsApp group stating that Henry Chau had killed both of his parents. It was shocking that the person who reported the crime was the biological son of the missing couple. It was also the same person who had confessed the horrific truth to his friends. To prevent the suspect from doing anything further, at 7:00 a.m. that day, the police immediately went to Henry Chau's residence in Sai Ying Pun. After being arrested, he gave the police the address of Angus and said they would find his parents' bodies inside the apartment. At 10:30 a.m. the same day, the police also arrested Angus, 35, at an apartment in the Tsui area. Both men were charged with the murder of Mr. and Mrs. Chau in early March 2013. However, investigators stated that there was still a long way to go before they could prove what had happened to Mr. and Mrs. Chau. The classic confessions and blame shifting. 1. Henry Chau. When brought to the police station, Henry Chau quickly expressed his anger toward his mother since elementary school for forcing him to learn piano. He promised himself he would never forgive her for making him do it. Furthermore, Henry had often been frustrated with his father for not agreeing to lower the volume of the TV so he could focus on studying. This frustration led him to feel that his failures were all caused by his parents. Next, when asked if Henry Chau had hidden any secrets in the disappearance of Mr. and Mrs. Chau, Henry Chau confessed that he had invited his parents to Angus's apartment in the Tsui area. Initially, he wanted to carry out his plan in Shenzhen, a province of China bordering Hong Kong. However, Angus suggested that Tsui would be a better location. It was far from Henry Chau's residence, and it was a densely populated area, so they wouldn't be easily noticed. Henry agreed and began executing the plan to lure his parents into the deadly trap. As soon as they got his parents into the living room, Henry and Angus felt ready and launched a fierce attack. Although Henry Chau had confessed to his friend about carrying out the murder, he still played the role of the victim. Firstly, he repeated that 6 months prior to the attack, he had wanted to commit suicide but was persuaded by Angus to take revenge on his parents. Secondly, Henry Chau described his accomplice Angus as a very strong man who grabbed his mother from behind, covered her mouth, and used a weapon to slash across her neck. At the same time, Henry attacked his father's neck, but was unable to kill him. It was Angus who came to help, and once again used the weapon to slash across Mr. Chau's neck. Henry Chau further described Angus's violence and aggression by saying that during the struggle between Henry and his father, Angus had accidentally stabbed Henry in the thigh and also lost a finger. Therefore, even after both parents were dead, Henry had to go to the hospital to get 11 stitches, as recorded by the hospital's CCTV. Thirdly, Henry stated that, after a few hours with no wounds, when he returned to the apartment, Angus had already dismembered and preserved the bodies. Although their initial plan was to cover the body parts with sand and cement, shaping them into bricks to build a wall between the kitchen and the living room, perhaps Angus realized that this task was difficult and the results were uncertain, as the bricks they made might not be perfect and could arouse suspicion. So, he decided to do it alone. All of these blame-shifting actions were a prelude for Henry Chau to later plead guilty to manslaughter and receive a reduced sentence. 2. Angus. When Angus learned that Henry had confessed, he did the same. By that time, he had been detained for 40 hours and interrogated for 9 consecutive hours. However, Angus was not as articulate as his friend, and with his slow thinking after a failed suicide attempt, his words were of no significance in the investigation. Now, the police had a confession from Henry, as well as evidence from his messages to friends on WhatsApp, where he confessed to the crime. But was still not enough to convict both men. Investigators knew they needed to gather more evidence to support Henry's murder confession. Immediately later that day, when Henry was arrested, the police executed a search warrant at Angus's apartment in the Tsui area. And this was when the horrifying scenes began. As soon as the police entered the apartment, they likened the crime scene to a slaughterhouse. Blood and flesh were scattered everywhere, accompanied by an unbearable stench. The carpet on the floor was also stained a deep red, revealing a troubling clue about the horror. Upon closer inspection, the police realized that the apartment appeared to have been specifically prepared for this murder. In the living room, there were 3 black plastic bags filled with sand and cement, and the bedroom contained a cutting board, a trash bag, 600 food containers, a bucket with a saw, and 7 knives, which clearly indicated that this was a dissection room. 3 trash bags in the corner of the room contained arms, legs, and some bone fragments. Although shocked, the police tried to remain calm and proceeded to check other areas. In a small storage room next to the kitchen, there were 2 refrigerators, each with a microwave on top. When the police began to open the freezer of the first refrigerator, they were horrified to find Mr. Chau's severed head lying inside. Mrs. Chau's frozen head was found in the adjacent freezer. It took several minutes before the police could believe what they were seeing. Truly, if the Chau's son had done this, nothing could be more merciless. Still in shock, the police discovered neatly arranged lunchboxes in the refrigerator, with human meat presumed to have been microwaved in the microwave on top of the fridge, accompanied by BBQ sauce on the rice. Trembling, they opened the microwave to check, and indeed, it still had yellow human fat residue inside. One of the investigators admitted that after processing the crime scene, he couldn't eat meat for a long time. A forensic researcher confirmed that the body parts were perfectly aligned with the 2 skeletons of Mr. and Mrs. Chau. This expert believed the couple had been attacked in the chest or throat, leading to their deaths before being viciously dismembered in such a cruel manner. Trial of the prodigal son in Hong Kong. At the trial on August 8, 2014, the prodigal son confessed to the heinous crime but argued that he had murdered his parents while in an unstable mental state, hoping to reduce his sentence. Henry Chau's older brother probably couldn't save him either, as he sorrowfully stated that Henry had likely been haunted by the beating he received when he was 5 or 6 years old, and had harbored hatred for everyone since that time. Then, unable to hold back tears, he said, "Although we are brothers, we rarely talk to each other. When my mother was alive, she always said that my brother had something wrong in his head. And she always tried to pull Henry out of the darkness." Henry lived in his own world, thinking in his own world, and believed that the world owed him a lot. On the other hand, experts in the field completely rejected the argument that mental instability should be used as a reason to lessen the guilt. First was psychiatrist Lee Sing-Heish, who had met Henry Chau 30 times during his detention while awaiting trial. He stated that, despite planning and carrying out the gruesome murder of his parents, Henry did not have any mental illness. Henry Chau considered himself the center of the world, completely incapable of empathizing with others, and prone to blaming others for his problems. He placed high expectations on himself, but only in the imaginary world of his own creation. The doctor concluded that he only suffered from a personality disorder with traits of narcissism and sociopathy. The second expert, researcher Mark Kuhn Hung, emphasized and provided evidence at the trial to offer a deeper insight into the horrific final moments that Henry Chau's parents had to endure at the hands of their own son. He described to the court what he saw when opening the 2 sealed refrigerators and discovering the human heads. The heads were neatly placed on towels with their eyes wide open, completely clear. Henry Chau must have been fully alert to commit such a heinous crime. Third, criminologist L. Ding Kai stated that serial killers are generally sociopaths, having no emotional connection to their victims and treating them as objects. If they work in pairs, they typically share a common grudge or interest when they find a shared target. One leads, while the other follows orders. Both Henry Chau and Angus completely fit this case. Finally, after undeniable evidence and arguments, the prosecution rejected Henry Chau's defense or request for a reduced sentence. The jury, which consisted of 9 members, found 8 votes in favor of convicting Henry Chau of murder, and sentenced him to life imprisonment. He appeared calm as the sentence was delivered, while Angus repeatedly nodded and almost cried upon hearing that he would be released. Henry Chau, a young man who had always been provided with a comfortable life but failed repeatedly, had to live in a state of despair and lack of purpose. Ultimately, he refused to change and blamed others. Even more heartbreaking was that the ones he blamed were none other than his own parents, who had birthed and raised him all those years. This became a hot topic in Hong Kong's public discourse at the time, focusing on the warped mindset and blame-shifting of a failed individual. In a rare move, when the jury's decision for a life sentence for the criminal was announced, Judge Michael Stuart Moore could not hold back and exclaimed that Henry Chau always blamed everyone except himself. Now, he was a complete failure, both in life and spirit.